Hello there, Exiles. Halo here, and welcome to my Spark Inquisitor Duo Guide for Path of Exile, Lake of Kalandra League. At its core, Path of Exile is a game about taking your numbers and making them into bigger numbers, but it's not so simple. Every build must make sacrifices to attain these bigger numbers. Some builds sacrifice comfort, other builds sacrifice currency. A few forbidden builds even sacrifice your GPU itself. But we sacrifice the sanity and self-respect of an Aurabot player. Lured in by promises of power and currency, the Aurabot, also known as the Scionist Service, has divested themselves of the ability to interact with the world alone. Bound by an infernal pact in the price of regret orbs, they have no choice but to follow us around and bestow upon us unlimited power. This guide will cover everything you need to know to go from level 1 up to killing the most juicy content in the entire game. There will be detailed leveling trees, there will be different skill sets and gear sets, there will be detailed notes in the notes section, as well as a section at the end for frequently asked questions. We will not go over the Aurabot itself, as that is contained in its own video guide, which you can find linked in the description. We'll start by going over the fundamental mechanics of this build and what makes it so ridiculously powerful on such little currency. Firstly, this is a character that has been built from the ground up around playing with an Aurabot. These optimizations mean that when we're together with our Aurabot, we are ludicrously powerful, but when we play alone, the character doesn't really function. If you're looking to play solo Spark Inquisitor, I'd recommend checking out Garatha or James Humphrey, as they have good Spark Inquisitor guides. Having an Aurabot means that we don't need to invest into defensive or offensive auras, as all of those things are covered by the Aurabot. This lets us index much more heavily into damage with our passive tree without actually being squishier. In fact, we are much tankier than solo builds. Spark is an incredibly powerful skill that has several different mechanical advantages over other self-cast spells. The first advantage Spark has is, like Seismic Trap, it allows you to preload your damage on bosses and enemies in things like Simulacrums. The second advantage is that Spark can hit enemies on your screen without directly targeting them. At a certain point of investment, all you do is right-click and everything on your screen and beyond will just die, regardless of where you're aiming. The difference between a skill that can hit every enemy on your screen at once, like Seismic Trap or Spark, and something that has to be aimed, like Reap or Crackling Lance, is massive and cannot be overstated. The third major mechanical advantage of Spark is it allows you to scale projectile speed, skill effect duration, number of projectiles, and pierces to allow Spark to shotgun in a way. I want to talk about our Ascendancy node choices, but before I do that, I need to answer the question of why run an Inquisitor Spark over an Assassin Spark carry. The short and simple answer to that question is that from my testing, over 100 hours of testing in game and in Path of Building, for a duo carry, Inquisitor is better at every level of investment in terms of both defense and offense. Now, if you have a juiced up curse spot that's shredding enemy monster resists by 150 or 200%, then Assassin has a lot more merit. But barring that exception, nothing the Assassin tree offers is really that good. The Assassin power charge Ascendancy nodes are really bad. On a Spark carry setup that's running the Inner Conviction Timeless Jewel notable, these 4 Ascendancy nodes only give the carry about 28 to 30% more damage. But it's so much worse than that, because running Inner Conviction means that you can't run Dance with Death. Dance with Death gives the Inquisitor carry on average 50 to 70% more damage, and it doesn't require you to invest in power charges on the passive tree. The Mistwalker node from Assassin gives Elusive and means you don't take extra damage from critical strikes, but we can get Elusive on boots if we really want to, and we can use the Brass Dome or take the Crit Mastery for reduced extra damage taken from crits, as well as other sources of that stat to effectively achieve the same thing. Opportunistic is a decent Ascendancy node, but it's nowhere near good enough to redeem this Ascendancy as a whole. Now let's take a look at Inquisitor. Righteous Providence gives us about 300% increased crit chance on average, as well as 50 strength and intelligence. Not only is that as much crit chance as you'd get from 6 power charges, but we can also pick up power charges from another source, and the 50 strength and intelligence are really good. We get damage from the strength from Iron Will, we get life, and then we get ES off the intelligence. This is a really good node. Next up, we have Inevitable Judgment. This allows our critical strikes to ignore the enemy monster's elemental resist. While we can't benefit from gaining penetration from something like Trinity support, things like high Simulacrum wave modifiers that give the enemy 70 or 80 Ele res, the same thing on Uber Cortex, or even just rares that roll extra Ellie res, don't benefit from that resistance they get. Now this can be a downside if you have something like a curse bot that's shredding the enemy's resist anyway, but this is a really good node and there's a reason almost every hit-based Inquisitor takes it. Next up, we have Sanctuary and Pious Path. These nodes give us an enormous amount of life regen from Consecrated Ground. They then effectively double that life regen by allowing it to also apply to our energy shield. They cause curses to have 75% reduced effect on you. They make enemies take 22.5% increased damage. And they allow you to easily run Righteous Fire for 40% more damage. To summarize, Inquisitor is really, really good, and in my opinion, completely outshines Assassin for a duo setup like this. Like the Seismic Trap carry last league, we use Petrified Blood to allow us to get 30% more damage from Pain Attunement while only being slightly weaker against hits. Petrified Blood builds are generally weak to damage over time effects, since you reserve half your life, but with Inquisitor regen and Leth Shade, this isn't that big of a deal. We use the Annihilating Light staff to always deal triple damage. It turns out that this is slightly more damage than using perfectly rolled nebuluses at 90% max res. Annihilating Light does have a massive downside, however, as it reduces our elemental resist by 60% with a perfect roll. We counteract this by picking up a fair amount of resistance from the tree as well as on our gear, and capping our resist by staying near the Aurabot. We can also cap our resistances by getting Ellie resist on a flask. This may sound a bit scary, but from my experience in testing it, it feels completely fine. Besides, if you're running into packs of enemies without flasks up and without your Aurabot nearby, you're almost certainly already dead. We do of course pick up nebuluses when we can, since the downside of Annihilating Light is really irritating to mitigate, but for budget versions, it's absolutely fantastic. Our defense layers are pretty solid. First, we have armor and evasion and energy shield from the Aurabot, as well as from flasks and gear. We get max res from the elemental purities that the Aurabot runs, 83% max res at low budget, and then 87% max res from the Aurabot at high budget, and then we can pick up that next 3 max res from somewhere pretty easily. While not traditionally considered a defensive layer, we always cap our chaos res since that's the only damage type that our Aurabot can't help mitigate. We run cast when damage taken Molten Shell, of course, with Vol Molten Shell as an emergency panic button, and Purity of Elements makes us and our Aurabot immune to elemental ailments while also helping counteract the downside of the Annihilating Light. One massive source of defense for us is Soul Link from the Aurabot. First, this makes us take 14% less damage, and this does apply to the Righteous Fire degen. And then second, it causes 30% of the damage we take to be applied to the Aurabot's energy shield instead of us. This effectively gives us 66% more effective hit points. Finally, and not to be underestimated, we freeze things. We freeze them a lot. Either Blast Freeze on a Cluster Jewel or the Eldritch implicit on our gloves let us spread our freezes to other nearby enemies when we freeze something. Even with very little investment in our characters, we are already tankier than most higher investment solo characters. So let's talk about the passive tree, our gear, and our skill gems a bit, but before we do that, we need to go over the PoE configuration settings. We can see that the build has many different versions of the passive tree. Each version has an accompanying skill and gear set to go along with it. So in switching between versions, make sure to always change the passive tree, the skill set, and the gear set at the same time to keep everything synced up. The next important thing to note is that we can't actually have different configuration sets in the same PoB. This means that if we want to take a look at the variant of the build meant to farm early Feared invitations, that we have to manually turn on Brittle to 6 when we open that tree, and we have to turn off Brittle when we switch to another one. The higher investment version of this build uses double Call of the Brotherhood as well as double Nebulous. For those items to function correctly, we need to open up the configuration setting, go to Custom Modifiers, scroll down through the auras, turn on Hatred, and turn on the higher aura effect version of Elemental Purities. Unfortunately, there's no way to do this automatically. Looking at the passive tree, I don't think anything needs particular explanation. All the masteries and keystones should be fairly self-explanatory. I will talk about the cluster jewels a little bit, since people will want to know how to craft them. First, we have the large cluster jewels with Prismatic Heart. This gives us a little bit of Ellie res and damage, really nice for mitigating Annihilating Light. So the way you craft this is just by spamming Alteration Orbs with Orbs of Augmentation. You'll get Prismatic Heart with a second notable that pushes Prismatic Heart to the front within like 50 alts. Then we have our medium cluster jewels with Repeater and Streamlined. These are actually our best in slot notables, and they are super easy to craft. On average, it's like 2 or 3 Shuddering Fossils to get both of these. They're also both available at level 1, so item level on this jewel does not matter. Finally, we have our Blast Freeze cluster jewel, and we can craft this by alt spamming for Blast Freeze, and then Aug and Regaling for a second notable, and every single other notable that can roll on a cold cluster jewel except Stormrider will push Blast Freeze to the front. This is very easy and cheap to do. All of these cluster jewels are on very cheap bases too, so you shouldn't have any problems getting your cluster jewel set up. So let's talk about leveling trees and skills a little bit. So first off, we take all of these notables on the left side. This is very efficient pathing. And then we go and take the Lightning Mastery to make our damage with non-critical strikes lucky, and Elemental Overload to give us 40% more damage. Once we have these two things, along with the crafted scepters that are the Alteration Orb plus a Magic Scepter plus a rare Topaz Ring to give us the flat lightning damage to spells, once we have this set up, we're pretty much blasting the entire campaign all the way into the end of maps. Once you get a good cast speed damage scepter, you can swap it out. But you can kill Act 10 Katava with these things. It's pretty crazy. For our skills, early on we use Spark, Pierce, Arcane Surge in a 3-link, and then we use Orb of Storms with Onslaught and added lightning damage. Decoy Totem is incredibly good for early leveling. It's super underrated. It just makes so many of the early bosses easier. You just throw down a Decoy Totem and you can stand still in DPS because they hit the totem. Then we use level 1 Arcane Surge with Frostblink. Frostblink is really nice because it works well with Leap Slam with faster attacks. It just helps you move around really fast. And then we use Clarity and Herald Device on our mana. We also pick up a Karui Ward as soon as possible because the projectile damage and projectile speed are really good stats for us. Along with the movement speed and attributes, I cannot recommend this item enough. This should be the very first thing you spend a Chaos or Alcon or whatever it costs. On League Start, we're still running this amulet well into red maps. The rest of the leveling is pretty simple. One thing you may not know about is the compare function in PoB. What you can do is check this compare box and then set the next passive tree you want to transition to on the right, and it'll highlight in green what you have to add to get there. So you can see if we want to go from level 25 to level 45, we just add the nodes that are highlighted in green. And you can see if we swap to the early mapping tree and compare it to the 200C investment version, the things that we have to unspec are shown in red. This is a very useful feature, and it should make your leveling trees feel a little bit nicer to use. As always, when transitioning between versions, moving up to level 45 here, make sure to check the items and the skills. And the items, we add Nocturnal Caress and we put Survival Instincts in our jewel slot. And you can see in our skills set that we add a 4th link to Spark at this point in the game. Always make sure to sync your leveling tree with your skill set and your item set. Detailed leveling information about where you get your gems can be found in the notes section of the guide. Once you've progressed to the early mapping version of the character, you pick up a Tabula Rasa, buy some move speed boots if you don't have them already, pick up whatever 1C rares you need to cap out your resistances and get a little bit of life, upgrade your scepters by either essence crafting them with some cheap essences or just buying them off trade for a few chaos, and then from this point on, all of the investment goes into the Aurabot. Then, once your Aurabot has their Prism Guardian and Victario setup completely finished, you transition into the 200 Chaos version of this character. At this point, you have completed the well-rounded budget setup for the duo build. You are strong enough to do all but the hardest content in the game. You probably can't do Wave 30 Simulacrum Deathless. You can certainly make it to Wave 25. You probably can't do Giga-juiced Feards, but you can probably do White Feards or Feards with no meaningful mods. You can do things like Uber Elder or Sirus very easily, as long as you know the fights. And other than 100% Deli, nothing that happens in a T16 map should be anything of a problem for you. From this point, there are 3 variants of this build meant to farm 3 different types of content. These variants are for people who know what they want to do and want to optimize the build to do one of these 3 specific things. If you're just doing general content, this 200C well-rounded version will serve you well. The first of these 3 variants is the Magic Find version. This version sacrifices a lot of damage and some tankiness in order to stack insane levels of increased item quant and increased item rarity. Fortunately, it is very easy to tone down your Magic Find a little bit in exchange for massive amounts more damage. So if you find you want more damage, the first thing you should do is drop Centauri's Answer in favor of using a rare wand. That's a very easy 40% more damage. The next thing you can do is drop item rarity support and pick up increased critical damage support. That's another very easy 40% more damage. As it stands, without making any changes, we have 105% item quant and 448% item rarity. I'd recommend you farm T16 20% deli maps with reliquary scarabs, and juice with whatever content you enjoy or want to spec into the Atlas passive tree with. To explain a few things about how our gear works, we're using a white wand and a blue helmet because of the ascetic gold amulet, which gives us a fair amount of quantity and rarity if you have a normal and magic item equipped. We use a white wand because that's the only slot we can't get more magic find stats in, and we use a blue helmet because we can buy a synthesized rarity of items found implicit helmet and then alt augment for rarity prefix and rarity suffix. You obviously don't have to have max quantity of items found rolled venters. It's nice, but you can also use white socket pariahs for that. I will say though, the rarity of items that you get from venters is very nice. You don't need it, but I have a corruption on Sidimia's Touch because it should be pretty easy to get. This is generally a very cheap item. I would pick up Curse enemies with Temp Chains, Enfeeble, and then Punishment in that order, and if none of those are available, it's no big deal. It's just a nice extra defensive layer. We can actually sustain basically 100% uptime on Divination Distillate because Petrified Blood gives skills a life cost if you have above low life. And since Divination Distillate doesn't actually heal you that much and we cast spells really fast, by only reserving 25% or so of our life, we're able to spend life at a faster rate than Divination Distillate regains it. It's worth noting here that getting quality on Divination Distillate is bad. You always want a 0 quality 1 because you want to be gaining as little life from it as possible. On to the Simulacrum variant. This is designed to be able to comfortably, reliably do Wave 30 Simulacrum as cheaply as possible. We use Enduring Composure on a small armor cluster jewel to generate endurance charges, and we put a Thread of Hope on the left side of the tree to pick up a lot of block chance, glancing blows, Divine Shield, and some staff nodes. We also change our tree a little bit to pick up freeze duration. The Fingers of Frost Wheel and the Cold Mastery for freeze duration are really nice for farming simulacrums. Like other versions of this build, we use the Call of the Void Ring as it's an extremely powerful defensive tool and is almost as good as just adding Fortify to both characters. This version has a little bit harder of a time getting elemental resist, so we get our freeze prolif on our gloves, and we use Prismatic Heart as a cluster jewel notable. You can still use a Blast Freeze cluster jewel if you want, you'll just have to pick up a little bit of extra Ellie res elsewhere. There's a lot of other smaller optimizations to be found in this variant, so be sure to look through it thoroughly when you spec to it. And then finally, we have the early feared farming variant. This version uses Call of the Brotherhood and a Gale Sight to apply Brittle to enemies, basically doubling our base critical strike chance from 6 to 12. There are few major changes in this variant. There's just a lot of small optimizations I've made to make farming the feared a lot smoother on as cheap of a budget as possible. And then finally, we have the mid to high investment version of the build. This should cost around 2,000 chaos, give or take. The new economy is going to be kind of wacky with exalts and divines changing and uniques being changed in rarity, but this should be a relatively accurate measurement of how much it'll cost to get this setup. With this setup, you'll be able to easily do Uber bosses as well as any other content in the entire game. It is extremely powerful. This version does need to be accompanied by the equivalent investment level of the Aurabot PoB, as we do use double Call of the Brotherhood as well as 2 Nebuluses, so we need the extra aura effect in the higher level purities on the Aurabot. We use an Asenath Brutal Restraint to be able to pick up the Dance with Death Keystone. This makes it so we can't use helmets, but gives us about 50 to 70% more damage and is extremely powerful. This does make enemies damage with critical strikes against you lucky, but we use the Brass Dome to never take extra damage from critical strikes, so this isn't even a downside. Brass Dome also can provide us with the +3 maximum res to cap out at 90 elemental resists. We also add quality to some of our gems at this point where it's efficient, and we use Anomalous Blood and Sand with a level 3 enhance to get a fair amount of extra projectile speed for pretty cheap. Since we have some extra life to reserve something with, we use Dread Banner to provide nearby enemies with less accuracy rating. There are so many more ways you can invest into these characters if you want to push them even farther, but I stopped at this point in investment because you can already pretty much one-shot everything and it's very hard for you to die. Most of the investment past this point is just going to make your numbers in PoB a little bit bigger and make it a little bit easier to face tank the hardest hitting abilities in the game. Now, Seek and I are working on Aegis Aurora with melding versions of both the Aurabot and the carry, and we are going to try to kill a 300 quant feared while completely AFK using nothing but a 1-link Tempest Shield with those versions of the build. Those versions are completely overkill, and since they don't exist yet, won't be part of the guide, but if you pull the PoB again close to league start, they should be updated and included there. I talked about it a little bit previously, but let's go through our skills and talk about what each one of them does. We have our main 6-link that sometimes changes depending on what variant we're running. We have Flame Dash with Arcane Surge to proc Arcane Surge easily, as well as Sigil of Power and Frost Shield. Sigil of Power and Frost Shield are things that you put on the ground and stand in, and then they ramp their effect as you spend mana while standing inside of them. Frost Shield takes a little bit of your energy shield in the first second or so when you cast it, so if you enable it in the PoB, it will show your net energy shield regen in the negative because it's including the initial Frost Shield degen in that. So, because seeing your net energy shield regen is important for judging whether or not you can run Righteous Fire, I usually keep it off in all of the versions of the build. We want to reserve 50% of our life. To do this, we either use a Herald, Arctic Armor, or Anomalous Blood and Sand with Dread Banner. For our mana reservation, we use Petrified Blood and Purity of Elements. We use Sniper's Mark since we're a projectile skill and that's a nice multiplier to our damage, but in some versions we actually have the Aurabot run it, since we'd rather have the Aurabot cast the mark and let the carry keep casting Spark. And that's about it for the passive tree skill gems and gearing section. I've put dozens of hours into PoBing this build, so I could have talked about this forever, but I tried to keep it pretty short and concise. So let's go over some frequently asked questions now. We'll start with how do we level as a duo? First, the notes and guide sections for the carry and the Aurabot are going to be extremely useful resources for you. Basically everything you need to know should be covered there. Second, there is a Reddit post made by Seek explaining how to skip zones by using the swirly button with party members. A member of our community Discord, Nicholas, also made an excellent PDF guide of how to do efficient zone splitting from Acts 1 through 5. Links to both of these can be found in the description, in the notes section of the PoB, or in the Useful Resources channel of the community Discord. What build should a third party member play? I made a hybrid Mana Guardian Cursebot build that I would play if I was a third man in this duo setup. It's not a complete guide, but you can find a video explaining it linked in the description below. What do we do if we're playing alone and our Aurabot is asleep or something? The most important thing to say to that is if you think that is going to happen often, then you probably don't want to play a duo setup where you heavily rely on being together for your builds to function. But assuming you're running the 200 Chaos version of the build, I would drop Annihilating Light for just a decent rare staff, and then I would farm low-level maps or heist to generate a little bit of currency. Another good option is to play Hideout Warrior, and then you don't have to respec at all. Flip uniques, div cards, craft for profit, or anything else you know how to do. It's not a question, but I forgot to mention it earlier, so I'll cover it now. There will be better trading folders linked in the description of the video, the notes section of the PoB, and the Useful Resources channel in the Discord. These should help make early gearing a lot easier. You can see if we look through the Jewel template, we can choose which affixes we want to search, and they're all presented nice and organized, so you don't have to custom make a search every time you want to look for an upgrade to a piece of gear. The final question, what do I do if I want to play this but I don't have any friends? Well, in the Discord server, there is a looking for group channel where other people who also want to play a duo setup and don't have friends have already posted messages looking for a party. Seek and I will be streaming the entire league start of Path of Exile Lake of Kalandra League, so if you want to see these builds in action, just stop by to say hi, or if you have any questions, stop on by. Links to the stream will be down in the description. And as mentioned earlier, we have a really nice and friendly Discord server growing. There's already 350 people in it, and it is a great place to get your questions answered quickly. Especially on League Start, when we're spending a lot of time playing, the Discord server might be the best place to ask your questions. Though, still leave a comment on the video, of course, for the old algorithm engagement metric. And, well, that's about it. If you'd like to give us a little bit of money, there's a donate link in the description. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys have an excellent league start in Lake of Kalandra League, and may the divines reign freely upon you.